I kind of want to just start off this whole interview with kind of easy questions for the people that want to learn more and maybe they don't know anything initially here. Can you maybe define transgender and gender dysphoria to our audience?
Absolutely. That's a great question right out of the gate. Something that is very important in establishing the difference between the two. Your transgender is a term that would describe an individual who's transitioning from one gender to the other, whereas the phrase gender dysphoria is more of a medical term, a diagnosis, if you will, just giving the medical community something to grasp onto to say, okay, this is what we're dealing with. Somebody who has gender dysphoria may have thoughts of transitioning from one gender to the other.
Okay. And a lot of people get this confused in talking about transgenderism, especially in the debates that we'll get into later in the interview. And people sometimes get sex and gender confused because you're sex assigned at birth, gender identity, and gender expression. So what is the difference between sex and gender?
Okay, well, I got to tell you, sex and gender have nothing to do with each other. Sex would be what you're assigned at birth based on your outward genitals, whereas gender is more perceived in your heart and your mind. That's what you determine you are, how you feel. That's where we find or define gender.
Okay. And I know in the studies that we've talked about before on the channel about the brain scans of transgender people and realizing that gender does live in your brain and, transgender people are in fact the gender they identify as, according to thousands of these studies now. And certainly there's more historical data to be done on this. But people also in our comments especially have been expressing their confusion on whether someone who expresses their gender dysphoria, is everyone who is transgender experience gender dysphoria, and does everyone who experiences gender dysphoria also happen to be transgender, or are they interchangeable?
Well, I would say that they are interchangeable, and in as such, when you talk about gender, there's such a wide variety of categories that this can fall under. There could be intersex people with Klinefelter disease, also known as androgen sensitive syndrome, which you are basically born with both sets of genitalia or ambiguous genitalia as a man and whatnot. So there are categories. There are also people, and this term it's not the best, one of my favorites, but autogynephilia, which has, maybe perhaps you get a thrill out of seeing yourself, dressed as the opposite gender that you're presenting as. So there's such a sweep of gender phrases that we can go through and talk to. So each of them could be interchangeable. As you go and you discover yourself and find more out about yourself, I think you start to whittle that down within yourself. And you categorize yourself. In my case, I identified more with women in my life, and I identified and related to them, much more than I did with other boys. Though I played sports in high school and middle school and such. It was always the girls and the cheerleaders or the majorettes that I, related to, better. So I felt comfortable. My grandparents, all my influences in my life. I questioned my fluidity. And I presented for a very long time as androgynous, so before we had all of the terms that we hear today, gender nonconforming or gender fluid, it was more androgyny for me. And so, yes, you can float in and out of those, and putting a label on, your gender is a vast category that you could swim through most of your life to discover and land where you're going to land. For me, finally coming out at age 56 here in Schuylkill County, it was a long and winding road to get here. So, and along the way, I've had these twists and turns. That's why they call it a journey, folks. you write your story.
You mentioned people who get a sexual pleasure out of dressing as the opposite gender. And I think that's where a lot of people might be confusing gender expression and transgenderism with drag performers. So I know there are drag performers who are also transgender.
Correct.
But a lot of people might say that's just a stepping stone to being transgender. And I wonder if you can comment on that. Yes. And the debate there.
I love this question because I'm going to start it out with a joke. It's a very old joke, albeit, and it's kind of corny, guys, so bear with me. What's the difference between a cross-dresser and a transsexual? The answer would be 2 years. Okay. So a lot of times, that is a stepping stone. That's a very valid point. But for the most part, most of the kings and queens that I know of, they take it off at the end of the night and they set it aside. That's a persona that they display on stage. Whereas, transgender people, we don't want to take it off. This is what we want. We want the skin 24/7. So there is a difference in that regard. And you're right. There are some cross-dressers out there who evolve into full-blown transgenderism, and some of them go all the way through gender-confirming surgery. So again, it's life is a journey, guys. Enjoy the ride. So,
all right, now I kind of want to take a shift, and obviously there are questions that, as Professor Pride, there are things that I know, but the audience doesn't. And some topics are more sensitive than others. But does the transgender community also serve as an umbrella term to define non-binary individuals, gender fluid, et cetera, et cetera?
Absolutely. The gender umbrella is so wide. There are so many terminologies that fall under the umbrella, and that is certainly every one that you mentioned is on point. Absolutely. It's hard, if you look at the history of transgender folks, two-spirited, people of our indigenous tribes here in continental United States. There had always been, some fluidity and spirit of people that we didn't have, words for. The cultures created their own words, so it's a whole different topic. We could go down that road someday and just spend a whole session talking about the history of trans people and all the notables as well.
Still not enough rainbows? Click here to see more weekly episodes of Powered by Rainbows, Semester 4, only on MHP TV.